Hello and welcome. The aim of this lecture is to first introduce you to the requirements of research ethics, which are the professional standards that guide academic research practices and processes. However, commercial research, and indeed research in the more applied sense as it exists beyond academia, does not have to follow the same strict limitations. And so the goal of part 2 of the lecture is to get you to think about the potential of ethical research. The concept of ethics is derived from moral philosophy and the principles that govern and direct a person while conducting an activity. Principles are a guide that help us to take actions that achieve our values. And values are things that we seek to protect. They are the things that we hold as being important. When I talk about a paradigmatic framework in previous lectures, this is an example of what I mean. Ethics, principles, and values form a framework for understanding certain types of behavior. This is not a static or rigid paradigm because each of these elements is in constant negotiation and change over time. There are very important reasons for institutional governance of research ethics because there have been instances in modern history and recent history where researchers have demonstrably dehumanized research subjects. The Second World War is notorious for the monstrous experiments conducted on prisoners by Nazi Germany. But most of the 20th century is marked by the terrible treatment of indigenous populations in Canada and Australia. In Australia, the stolen children of indigenous people were forced into colonial scientific experimentation. And the US is equally responsible for terrible human rights abuses in the name of research. One of the most infamous human rights abuses in the name of scientific research is the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, which were conducted between 1932 and 1972 by the US Public Health Service, that promised free healthcare to African American men, but deceived the more than 600 participants, of which 400 had latent syphilis and were not told, despite the risk of blindness, deafness, mental illness, heart disease, and death. Others were treated with placebos and known ineffective methods. Project MKUltra was a CIA program conducted with human subjects between 1953 and 1973, using psychoactive drugs, electroshock therapy, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, and sexual abuse, as well as a range of different forms of torture. And this was conducted across 80 different institutions, including colleges, universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies. Recently, declassified documents even show experimental work on the brain control implants of dogs, making them run and turn and stop via remote control. The full extent of the program will never be known. I'm also going to include a link to a video documentary on the infamous prison psychology experiments conducted by Professor Zimbardo at Stanford University in 1971 on the subject Moodle page. These are probably the most high-profile cases and worst-case scenarios, but they're important to mention because they remind us of the horrendous things that humans are capable of doing under the sanction of the idea of research. However, there are many much smaller-scale incidents where people's private information has been revealed, their reputations damaged, and their lives filled with anxiety because of otherwise well-meaning researchers. Because ethnographic research is very involved in the telling of stories of marginalized groups of people, the underrepresented, the previously unheard, and therefore vulnerable populations. We must conduct research carefully and with fully informed participants. As Donna Mertens in your reading this week says, qualitative researchers situate themselves in a consciously value-laden territory in which human relationships and critical self-reflection loom prominently. This positioning leads to the emergence of ethical dilemmas throughout the conduct of research. In order to manage these ethical dilemmas, all academic research that involves humans must go through an institutional human research ethics committee. All academic research is governed by the oversight of these committees, which are a formal organization that review the researcher's ethics applications, which include highly detailed accounts of the research plan and its rationale, as well as a justification for its goals, methods, procedures, and purposes. Ultimately, the ethics committee is seeking to understand any potential risk to the participant, where that risk may be physical, emotional, or even reputational. You can take a look at the UOW human ethics pages in the tutorials this week, and you can see that there are 2 different ethics committees, one that includes a panel for health and medical research, and one that is under the interesting banner of the social sciences. One of the most important elements of research ethics applications is known as the Participant Information Package. This is usually a comprehensive set of documents that includes a description of the research project, either in English or other languages. It explains the participants' rights and is a mechanism for obtaining formal consent and a mechanism for the participant to withdraw from the study. More on that later. The core principle here is, of course, seeking to avoid any potential harm that might be caused by the research. So the first principle of research ethics is do no harm. Not just in a physical sense, but also in an emotional sense. And it can be quite difficult to ensure, particularly when dealing with people who have been marginalized, victims of crime, people who have anxiety and other mental health conditions, people with disabilities, or people whose life experiences include illness or isolation, humiliation, and fear, such as refugees. In order to avoid harm, researchers and ethics committees are guided by the principle of care. Taking care of participants involves being respectful in your interactions. It means that the idea of the research project should not give rise to false hope. Taking care means that the data collection process should not be disruptive or interfere in any way in people's lives. And taking care means that the researcher should be prepared for awkward situations, which means having the self-awareness to reduce the difficulty in the situation. And being prepared, right? Having a process for handling difficult situations. Finally, the duty of care of the researcher is to ensure that the participants are fully informed about the procedure, which means understanding how the information they provide is going to be used, analyzed, and reported. And to whom, right? The audience of, who's the audience of the research? Who's going to see the products of this research? This all needs to be explained to the participant. And this can be quite difficult given language and cultural barriers. Anonymity is another core principle for human research. Not all research projects can offer complete anonymity, but ethics committees will require it, and you have to design the reporting of the research in such a way as to obfuscate the source. Again, this can be really difficult in small communities, especially when trying to follow the principle of honesty. In the Mertens reading this week, Carolyn Ellis is quoted in regards to her experience researching a small fishing village where she returned to and shared parts of her book about the people living there. Quote, "They were extremely hurt by what they heard. I had described them as smelling like fish and other things equally devastating. These people had become really good friends of mine. I loved them and cared for them. And what I said was very painful for them and also for me. I went back to the community and talked to them. Some people forgave me. Some people never did forgive me." Ellis demonstrates how the principles of research ethics can conflict with one another. On the one hand, it is important to respect the participants, but on the other, Ellis rejects the idea of presenting the stories in a camouflage way as to disguise identity. She writes, "Just how far do we need to take the idea of getting permission and approval for what we write? Do we need permission to write everything about anybody? Should I get permission from every character who appears in my writing, no matter how minimal? If we take this practice to the extreme, we won't be able to write honestly or critically about anything, including our own lives, especially our own lives. Don't I have the right to write about myself?" It is no wonder then that Carolyn Ellis has become such an important proponent of the method of autoethnography, because research ethics can be overly constrictive as to disavow important research. Ellis argues that as a researcher, she has an ethical obligation to bring the issues of prejudice and discrimination to the attention of the community she is researching and others. She fears that if research participants know what she intends to publish before it is done, it would lead to a confrontation and block the progress that research might help bring about. The digital environment complicates this even further because it can be almost impossible to promise anonymity for online participants, particularly if you're sourcing information from participants on Facebook or Twitter. These statements can, of course, be searched for. Even images from Instagram can be reverse image searched on Google to find the original. Not all social media are equal. For example, people tend to use more pseudonymous profile names on Reddit than they do on Twitter, which is still more anonymous than Facebook, which uses real names. 4chan, on the other hand, is completely anonymous. The final principle of research ethics is confidentiality, which is a condition that you must negotiate with the research participants contributing to your study, in which case you would agree on how much of their statements you could use, for example. Also, while you would retain their personal information and contact information, you may not share that information without the participants' explicit permission. Back in 2010, I was researching the experience of women working in the video games industry in Australia. During a series of interviews with women working as artists, coders, designers, playtesters, and managers, one participant shared some very interesting information. Nothing scandalous, but it certainly influenced the way I proceeded with the direction of the research. However, after about 6 months of work based on this key information, I was contacted by that participant through the participant information package. The participant had changed studios, had a new promotion, and had some important confidential commercial agreements in place, and she wanted to withdraw her consent to participate in the study. Now, her insights were extremely important to the main direction of the article that I was working on, and even though I could have made the content of those interviews entirely anonymous, it was still possible that someone somewhere could connect the information that she was sharing to her identity. So I just decided to shelve that article and went in a different direction with the research. These are just the risks of research ethics, which are there to protect the participant. In the second part of this lecture, I want to start to move away from the idea of formal research ethics of academic research, and to start to think about the concepts of ethical research for those working in the creative industries, where you are no longer strictly governed by formal ethics committees. In what is often referred to as the private sector, there are other considerations that come into play when dealing with the expressions and contributions of potential research participants. Because of the expense and the time-consuming nature of this research process, there is a cost involved in an ethnographic research project that will limit what can be achieved. There are also issues of intellectual property in terms of who owns the product of the research. However, as Professor Norman Denson argues, the goal of research is to provoke change, to create texts that play across gender and race, utopian texts that involve readers and audiences in this passion, moving them to action. Just because you might be researching for a commercial organization or a client, that doesn't mean you don't have an opportunity to change the world, as Denson argues, to engage in ethical research that makes a positive difference. How you define that positive difference is up to you and your research contributors. So, as Merson suggests, if the research participant is an active agent in the decisions about the use of data and findings, this opens up new possibilities related to ethical challenges associated with representation, voice, and credibility. This leads to the question, are research participants merely data sources? Or is there an opportunity to build an open, ethical, and ongoing relationship that does not imagine participants, but rather research collaborators? There are already models of collaboration that exist both online and within fan communities that can serve as inspiration for reimagining the research participant as a collaborator. One of these is called collective intelligence, and this includes open source software and free software and related initiatives like the Creative Commons. There's also games modding and open access, which we'll talk about in a minute. And of course, fan wikis. Now, there are some pretty big caveats when we're thinking about doing collaborative ethnography. And the first is sensitive topics and marginalized groups. This approach might not suit certain issues and experiences. The first hurdle is to rethink what is public. Research ethics have been struggling with what Winter and Lavis call the ambiguities of publicness surrounding participation online. That is because it is quite natural to think that anything we put on social media is public, and it is. But therefore people think it is also in the public domain, and that is not ethically or legally the case. While yes, a social media post is available to a public audience, by using the platform, the individual agrees to the terms of service agreement, such as the one for Twitter. I'll put a link here to that. And it's worth just bringing up on screen. I'm not going to read the whole thing. This is only a small part of the terms of service, right? And this is big, and it's so dense, no one ever reads these things. What it effectively is saying, by using the platform, you agree to allow the company, right, the operator of the service, to use any intellectual property you generate on the platform. Some terms of services take control of your intellectual property. I think Facebook, for example, has a level of ownership. Twitter says that you own your material, but it also owns the rights to do all of these things: copy, reproduce, process, adapt, modify, publish, transmit, and display anything you put on that platform. In the recent past, I've used individual tweets without permission in my research using quantitative data analytic packages because the decision of previous research committees was that tweets which are not contentious or incriminating, such as fan discussions, were okay to be used in research because they were in public and we were seeking to better understand fan activity. However, more recently I've begun to rethink this position because it is in effect forcing people to participate. Many people confuse publicness with the concept of the public domain. The public domain is a specific legal term for materials whose copyright duration has expired. The global standard for copyright duration is life of the author plus 70 years. Once that time is expired, the work is said to be in the public domain, where anyone can reproduce, alter, and change the work. This is why authors like H.P. Lovecraft are currently popular, because a large amount of his work is in the public domain. But virtually nothing created online is in the public domain unless people have specifically used a Creative Commons license to contribute that work to the public domain. Anything you create, you have copyright over. Every tweet, every blog post. But in using these social media platforms, you are agreeing to share that copyright with the companies that operate those platforms. For researchers and ethnographers, this is ethically very challenging. It's also very confusing because in Australia there are some exceptions. In the US, this is known as the Fair Use Doctrine, and in Australia it's the Fair Dealing Clause of the Copyright Act, which means you do have the limited right to use some elements of copyright works for education, reporting, satire, and parody. So research exists in a grey area, and the issue boils down to one of intent. And really, most people don't use social media with the idea of giving researchers permission to use their expressions. Most people, I would argue, think that accessing and using social media is free, but that is not the case. The value exchange involved in using social media is that the user pays for access, not only with their personal information, but with their expressions and their actions. This is the cost of algorithmic media. Every tweet, like, link, every click, every movement between one page and the next, every moment spent on a social media site is converted algorithmically into intellectual property that is then collated, analyzed, and used to improve the service, advertise the service, and also sold on to advertisers, and in turn used to sell advertising to you. Some view this as morally and ethically problematic, but I'm not so sure. Although what is clear is that most people use social media without being fully informed as to the use of their expressions. And I will agree that many lack the digital literacies to become informed. But the majority of users simply choose to ignore the terms of service conditions of the platform they use, and I view this as an expression of agency. The moral response to this issue is typically concerned with issues of power, particularly where researchers are working with minorities and the marginalized. However, as Harley and Langdon in your readings this week argue, power is too often an explanatory mechanism for the way networks of relations exist. And the term power obfuscates more complex ways to understand situations and view the agency of participants. For me, agency is the guiding principle of ethical research, and it is imperative that we maintain and respect the agency of participants. Some organizations will want to keep any research they do secret because they are paying you to do the research and it's important information, and therefore they own the product of that research. And so what I'm suggesting here is quite radical, but that is how new knowledge is produced, by challenging old orthodoxies. To create the conditions under which we can build communities of research collaborators, communities that respect the contributor's voice, agency, and intent, we can look to the games industry. Thanks to the success of platforms like Steam, the games industry can now sell you products that are unfinished, and then use the input from those early adopters and players to finish the games in ways that meet those players' demands. It's called early access. Early access to the game Deep Rock Galactic, for example, think a cross between Minecraft and the movie Aliens, began in 2018 after about 2 years of internal development. Players have then been collaborating with this Norwegian game developer to shape the commercial release of the game that happened earlier this year. By paying for early access and providing feedback, discussing issues, identifying problems, and proposing new ideas, players received access to new content as it was developed, and the prestige of being able to contribute and speak directly to the developers. The field of relations built between the company and its collaborating audience is quite extensive, as players contribute knowledge and information via Reddit, Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, the Wiki, and of course, Discord. This is a form of advanced advertising and marketing. However, it is also an extensive qualitative and quantitative research project that is incredibly valuable to the video game studio. It helps to improve all the elements of the product and the services surrounding it. These players do not have shares in the company, but they own the game's community. And they are collaborating because they benefit from a robust community and the contribution of others. So my view and my proposal here is that collaborative approaches to research in which knowledge and innovation become part of a community is one way to approach research in the creative industries in the future. Now, of course, it does come with many of the potential problems that we typically associate with crowdsourcing and collective intelligence. However, it acknowledges what Harley and Langdon call asymmetrical reciprocity, in which the participants and the research partners collaborate and each brings something unique to the challenge of developing new knowledge and experiences. Knowledge and experience that neither can possess individually, in a model which follows feminist writer Hannah Pitkin's conceptualization of power not as a dominating force, but as a potential to act, to have agency. Participants become collaborators rather than subordinate subjects of a study. Ethical research should be about engaging participants collaboratively in situations which allow them to express their agency, not to view them as powerless. Participants already have a voice, and ethical research should be about listening to that voice. Not because the participants are without power, but because of the agency and the capacity to act that they bring to the situation. I like this quote from Figlin et al. On the question of the real meaning of participatory research, the researcher mustn't come with their own solutions, but instead must be unbiased and flexible and finding out how the community thinks and is planning to address their own issues. One of the benefits of participatory research and development is that it can emphasize that poor people are competent and can do much of their own investigation, analysis, and planning. So although this reference is speaking about a particular marginalized group and economic stratifications, you can replace this notion of poor people with any group of people. And the point remains the same, that sometimes, as a researcher, the most important thing you can do is to provide a space for people to collaborate and then shut up and listen, and then take that message back to your audience. That's it from me this week. Hopefully this lecture has laid the foundation for thinking about research ethics and ethical research, and prompted some ideas about how you might work with communities of collaborators in the future for engaging, creative, critical, and ethical research. We'll pick up some of these ideas again over the next couple of lectures in thinking more about digital ethnography and the ethnographic research of fandoms. Thanks for listening, and happy researching.